This program is brought to you by RTS on iTunes U from the Distance Education Department of Reformed Theological Seminary. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.
All right, now let's look at the next phases of Greek philosophy. I'm going to skip over some movements. I'm not going to talk about Stoicism, and I'm not going to talk about skepticism as it developed in the later phases. Actually, skepticism, it's interesting, skepticism developed in the Platonic Academy. And that's kind of remarkable because Plato's whole purpose was to refute skepticism when the sophists proposed it. But apparently there were some people who were disciples of Plato who didn't think that his refutations of skepticism were sufficient, and so they became skeptics themselves. There is also, of course, the movement called Stoicism, which is actually mentioned in the New Testament. When Paul went to Athens, in Acts chapter 17, he met with philosophers who were Stoics and Epicureans, and that led to the address of Paul on Mars Hill. I do talk about these movements in the essay that I've given you to read called Greeks Bearing Gifts. And so you can see how these thinkers fit into the lectures that I'm giving here. But I do want to spend a little bit of time on Neoplatonism. Now, as I mentioned, Plato, the school of Plato, the pupils and the pupils of the pupils, the students of the students of Plato, went through a number of different phases. And as I said, one of the phases was a skeptical phase. But eventually, Platonism took on some religious overtones, and there came a kind of nostalgia for the old original Plato, and a lot of these things came together in a somewhat different pattern, so that by the AD era, there is something called Neoplatonism. You see Plotinus there, capital F, and his dates 204 through 269. So we're into the years of our Lord, and Plotinus, of course, is not a Christian, but Christianity is on the scene when Plotinus lives and when Plotinus develops his ideas. Neoplatonism is different from the original Platonism in several ways, but I think what Plotinus is trying to do is to overcome some of the problems in the original Platonism. Remember what I said about Plato, that for Plato, he's trying to come up with a system that accounts for all reality, that explains everything. And how is he going to do that? Well, he sets up this world of forms that's supposed to explain the material world. And my criticism of Plato is that, yes, you have these forms, but the forms don't explain the material world. The forms explain only the perfect things in the material world. They don't explain the imperfections. And of course, that's what we want. We want something that explains the imperfections. We want to have something that shows us why things are imperfect. And for Plato, that's simply a mystery. We want something that explains not only courage and justice, but something that explains the negatives, something that explains mud, hair, and filth. And Plato didn't give us that. In fact, toward the end of Plato's life, Plato wrote a dialogue called the Parmenides, and Plato recognized that he had failed to come up with a system of thought that accounted for all reality. Well, so here we have Plotinus. Plotinus wants to overcome that problem in Plato. Plotinus wants to do what neither Plato nor Aristotle could do, to find a single principle which accounts for everything, and not only which accounts for perfection, but what accounts for imperfection. Not only what accounts for for unchanging reality, but also for change, for plurality, not just for unity, but for plurality. Not only for being, but for non-being. Well, what can that be? Plotinus says that whatever it is, it's got to be a rational principle. It's got to be an intelligent principle. And so he says this. He says, intelligence is the first legislator, or rather it is the very law of existence. Parmenides therefore was right in saying thought is identical with existence. The knowledge of immaterial things is therefore identical with those things themselves. Now, I call that a rationalistic slogan, okay, from Parmenides, and Plotinus expresses his approval of it. Parmenides, there are a lot of ways of translating these words. What he's saying, another way of looking at it is the same thing that is and can be thought, all right? In other words, once you come up with a rational concept of something, then you've got the thing. And it's not just, we sort of have this picture when we're talking about human knowledge. Here's my mind, and here's the world. And we sometimes think, well, the idea is to have a correspondence. This is sometimes called the correspondence theory of truth. We need to have a correspondence between the ideas in my mind and the things in the world. We want my idea of the chair to correspond with the chair. We want my idea to be an accurate representation of the chair. But for a rationalist like Parmenides or like Plotinus, that's not enough. It's not enough that I have an accurate idea of the chair. My idea actually has to be the chair, okay? There has to be a unity between my thoughts and the world, between my ideas and the things that I have ideas of, so that there's really no difference between them, okay? My mind is the thing, and the thing is my mind. Now we'll see how that works out. Hegel was one who really pushed that idea very, very hard. But you see, if the idea is just correspondence, then my idea is not quite perfect, okay? Because there's a discrepancy. There's a difference between my mind and the chair. My mind is mental. The chair is material. So there's a discrepancy there. And that means, at least this is what Parmenides and Plotinus thought, I think, that means that my idea is not yet adequate, okay? And it won't be adequate until it actually becomes the chair, and the chair becomes my idea. There has to be a union between me and the world. And you remember how Parmenides worked that out. For Parmenides, there's only one being. Parmenides is a monist. And by the way, Hegel is a monist too. Parmenides is a monist. Everything is one. So there really is no difference between idea and reality. There's no difference between thought and the object of thought. Thought and the object of thought are the same thing. Now Plotinus picks this up, and Plotinus agrees with Parmenides there. The knowledge of immaterial things is identical with the things themselves. Well, how does he develop that into a philosophy? It's a little bit like Parmenides. It's a kind of monism. Plotinus says the most ultimate principle is what he calls the one. All right? Now, this is the fundamental principle for Plotinus. The one. Now, the one is kind of on the top of the scale of being. We have all this being, and then down here is the material world. So you can see Plato's form and matter scheme kind of dimly reflected here. The one is the realm of form, the matter is the realm down here. But there's a difference. The one has none of the properties of our experience because it's the principle behind these properties. Now, Plato's forms were, he had the form of greenness and the form of triangularity. With Plotinus, the one doesn't have any properties at all. The one is not green because it's the principle that explains greenness. See, this is what Plotinus wants, a principle that explains absolutely everything. And the one explains greenness, so the one is not green. The one explains humanity, so the one is not human. One is something behind humanity. The one explains virtue, so the one is not virtuous. The one also explains non-virtue. The one explains wickedness. And the one is not wicked either, but it is the explanation of wickedness. So you see, Plotinus is able to do something that Plato couldn't do. For Plotinus, the one explains absolutely everything, the negatives as well as the positives. Not just virtue, but the lack of virtue. Not just courage, but the lack of courage. Everything is explained by the one. And the one brings together everything in a single being. But you see what happens here. I mean, the one is a rationalistic principle. It explains absolutely everything. But almost all of a sudden, the rationalism shifts into irrationalism. And let me show you how that happens. This is remarkable. The one is not green because it's the principle of green. You can't really describe it. You can't really talk about it. In fact, it's strictly wrong even to call it the one, although Plotinus thought that was the closest you could get. But you really shouldn't call it the one because it's the principle of oneness. And it's the principle of manyness. So it's behind the one, it's behind the many, it's behind green, it's behind blue, and so on. So if it's going to be a thoroughgoing rational explanation for everything, we are agnostic about it. We can't say anything about it. Okay? You see how we go from rationalism to irrationalism? We start with a rationalistic principle, and then we discover we can't say anything about it. So it's a total mystery. And so, therefore, it's the same as saying that we don't have any answers, that we don't have any explanation for anything. So, rationalism, which leads to utter agnosticism, leads to irrationalism. Concerning the one, we are wholly ignorant. We can say only what it is not what it is. All attributes are limitations. The one, then, how can you know it at all? Well, you know it not through reasoning. You know it through mystical experience, okay? Plotinus is probably the first one in the Western world to develop, to incorporate mysticism into his philosophy. And the idea of mysticism is that you actually become one with God, so that there's really no distinction between God and yourself. All right? Remember, we talked about how in order to for your reason to work, in Plotinus's terms, it's not enough for your ideas to correspond with the world. Your ideas must be the world. There's a union between your ideas and the world. Now he's saying, if you're going to know the one, it's not enough that you be subject to the one or that you try to know the one or something. You've got to be the one, okay? You've got to be absorbed into the one. And you've got to know him then through mystical experience. So reason is very important for Plotinus, but in the end, reason is kind of a ladder that you climb up to get a better view, and when you've got that better view, you throw the ladder away. Once you become identical with God, once you become identical with the one, you don't need reason anymore. You've transcended reason. You've got beyond reason. So, rationalism, irrationalism, both in Plotinus in a very profound way. Now, there's also this concept of participation, which we need to talk about in connection with Plotinus, because, as I mentioned, there's a scale of being here. And the way Plotinus represents it, although he always runs into danger whenever he tries to talk about the one, the way he represents this is that the one emanates, kind of like a flashlight shining a light at you, emanates, or like a candle that sends forth a beam of light somewhere. This is not creation. Creation out of nothing is what you find in the Scriptures. In the Scriptures, you have God exerting an act of will and saying, let there be light, and there is light. This is not an act of will at all. I mean, the flashlight doesn't decide whether it's going to shine or not. The flashlight can't help shining. The candle can't help shining once it has a flame attached to it. So this is just kind of a necessary thing that happens. And the one emanates lower forms, kind of forms that are sort of like the one. So you have spirit, you have soul, you have mind, and eventually down here at the bottom of the scale you have matter. And so each of these things is not exactly the one, but remember what Plotinus says. He says that at some level we are all the one, and we're trying to get back there. We're trying to realize that we belong back there. In a way we are the one, and in another way we're not the one, and we're trying to get back to being the one again. It's not terribly easy to follow. Anyway, this is the chain of being. All things emanate. They flow inevitably from the one without any diminishing of the source, like light from the sun. And so you have mind, soul, and matter as the stages of emanation. Some things are farther from the source, some things are closer. Matter is farther from the one than the soul is. So as you go this direction, you get higher levels of being. As you go in this direction, you get lower levels of being. But all of these levels are emanations from the one, and they all participate in the one. The term participation is difficult to define, but Plato used it. The things here on earth participate in the forms. They have some important relationship to the forms. Now, the concept of participation intends to reconcile rationalism and irrationalism. Rationalism in the sense that these are one with the form, irrationalism in that they're different from the form. But insofar as the emanations are real, they are indistinguishable from the one, and there's no reason why they should emanate into lower forms. But insofar as the emanations are less than the one, they are unintelligible, and they destroy the one as a principle of explanation. Why, if the one is perfect in and of itself, why does the one spew out these lower forms of being? Well, that's Neoplatonism. Obviously, much more can be said about that. But I do want to talk about Gnosticism. Gnosticism is kind of like Neoplatonism, but there are significant differences between Gnosticism and Neoplatonism. And Gnosticism will form kind of a transition from talking about Greek philosophy to talking about Christian theology. We're going to be talking about the church fathers, and we want to see what they're dealing with. And one of the things that they're dealing with is Gnosticism, which is kind of similar in a way to Neoplatonism. Gnosticism begins probably in the 1st century. It's not entirely clear when it starts. It may be referred to in the New Testament. The New Testament writers may be talking about Gnosticism when they talk about people who don't believe that Jesus is the Christ, or they don't believe that Jesus has come in the flesh. That sounds like Gnosticism because, of course, Gnostics, like Neoplatonism, they don't like matter. So often they taught that Jesus did not take a material body to be his. So it may well be that some of the doctrinal problems that the apostles were writing about in the New Testament were forms of Gnosticism. But anyway, Gnosticism can be diagrammed kind of similarly to Neoplatonism. In Gnosticism, you have a highest being, sometimes called Buthos, supreme being up there. And then you have a continuum of semi-divine beings going down to the material world. Continuum. See, there are no sharp breaks in the line. One kind of shades off into the next one below. Same thing over here with Neoplatonism. No sharp breaks. Everything kind of shades off into the next stage, the next phase. So you have a continuum of semi-divine beings. These are called eons, or iones. And they have names that are probably familiar to you. If you studied Greek, one of them might be called Logos. And often there would be one partner, there would be two partners. There would be one that has kind of a masculine name and another one that has more of a feminine name. So you have Logos and then you have Zoe. Logos is word, Zoe is life. Pneuma and Psyche, spirit and soul. And there can be any number of these. It's not just 3 or 4. There can be any number of them. Then what happens is that there's one of these eons toward the bottom of the scale who makes a mistake. What my friend Peter Jones calls a cosmic goof. You may find it interesting to read some of Peter Jones's writings, The Gnostic Empire Strikes Back, and Spirit Wars, and Oneism and Twoism, and books like that, where he compares modern thought in many respects to ancient Gnosticism. But anyway, the Gnostics, like the Neoplatonists, didn't like matter very much. And so the way they described it, some being, one of these eons close to the bottom of the scale, performs a cosmic goof and makes a material world, erroneously makes a material world. Now, the chief purpose of human beings is to get free from the material world, to be reabsorbed into the higher dimensions, and eventually to become one with Buthos, to become God, and God to become us. So again, you have that mysticism, you have that union with God, that ontological union with God that's the interest of the Gnostics and also the interest of the Neoplatonists. I don't know how the one influenced the other. I think Gnosticism came earlier than Neoplatonism, but there may have been some influence here. The Neoplatonists didn't like the Gnostics at all. I look at that as kind of a family battle. Sometimes the fiercest battles are between people who are most closely related. But anyway, there was a lot of battling between the Gnostics and the Neoplatonists. Maybe the Gnostics thought the Neoplatonists were stealing their ideas or stealing their steam or something like that. But anyway, the Gnostics were the main antagonists of the Christians. Sometimes entered the church, under kind of false pretenses. And so we have a lot of Gnostic gospels, Gnostic writings that speak about Jesus, that speak about the apostles. There is this view today among some Bible scholars that these Gnostic writings were banned from the church unjustly. That is to say that the church should have permitted the Gnostics and the more and the prevalent party, the two parties should have lived together and gotten along okay and so on. But the group that turned out to be orthodox somehow banned the poor Gnostics and banned the Gnostic writings, and so we have a canon now that's made up of without any Gnostic writings in it. And some of these scholars think that's a shame that none of these Gnostic writings made it into the canon, and they want to put the Gospel of Thomas as one of the Gospels, so that we'll have 5 Gospels rather than 4. Well, I disagree with that. I disagree with that very strongly. I talked to Mike Kruger, who's written a very excellent book on the development of the canon called Canon Revisited, and Chuck Hill of the Orlando RTS campus wrote a book called Who Chose the Gospels, dealing with that range of issues. I think it can be pretty clearly shown that the Gnostics were not recognized at any time as Orthodox Christians. Indeed, we find the Johannine writings criticizing what may be Gnosticism at a very early point, but the Gnostics were trying to worm their way into the Christian fellowship. And what would happen is that the Gnostics would say, okay, if you want to know God, it's not enough for you to listen to Paul and Peter and John and so on. You need the secret knowledge, which only I can give you. And of course, the word Gnostic means knowledge. And so the Gnostics thought that they had access to a secret knowledge, which would come from the eons, of course. And so they would teach you how to escape from your material condition and how to rise up on the scale of being until you were able to become one with Buthos. And of course, this is so radically opposed to the gospel of the Bible as we have it. Because, you see, the creator-creature distinction is completely destroyed here. The incarnation is destroyed. You don't have Christ coming in a physical body. You don't have atonement. What you have is salvation through knowledge, through gaining more knowledge somehow. And you don't have salvation living in the new heavens and the new earth under the lordship of God. You find people rising up to become God. And so this Gnosticism is opposed to the Christian gospel at every point. And it's just utterly implausible. Anybody who's done any thinking about these things, it's just utterly implausible to imagine that Gnosticism is a form of Christianity and should have been treated as Christian in the early days. That was the dynamic between them. And so when we come to talk about early Christian thought, we have to take account of that relationship.
The preceding program has been brought to you by RTS on iTunes U and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.